Preface of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Preface. The publishers wish to call the attention of the little candy maker to the appendix of this book. The United States Food Administration, while it does not object to a moderate use of sugar in candy making, strongly advises that it be used sparingly in order that our soldiers and allies may be provided with this energy-giving food that they require. Accordingly, a number of recipes requiring a small quantity of sugar, or eliminating it entirely, have been prepared under the direction of this able administration, and the publishers, glad to cooperate in every way, take pleasure in incorporating these recipes and suggestions as an appendix. It should be noted, however, that the author has furnished throughout the book a number of recipes that conform in every way to the suggestions made by the government. End of preface.
Chapter 1 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Rosalind Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 1 Cool Weather Candies. Betsy Bobbitt was a little girl whose real name was Elizabeth, but who, whenever she had anything to tell, came rushing to her mother and bobbed about so much, just could not keep still, that she earned the name Betsy Bobbitt. Now, the funny part about the nickname was that it was not always appropriate. It only fitted when she came bobbing in with, "Oh, Mother!" and back and forth she would bob, well, if you ever saw a restless tiger at the circus, or at the zoo, pace back and forth in his cage, bobbing his head, you will know just how Betsy Bobbitt looked as she told her little story. Like most little girls, Betsy Bobbitt would often run errands for the neighbours, and nearly always they would insist upon giving Betsy Bobbitt a penny, saying, "Thank you, dear. Now buy yourself a stick of candy." Poor Betsy Bobbitt! How she did wish she might buy the candy, because if there was anything Betsy Bobbitt liked, it was candy. And poor Mother, how she wished the neighbours would not be so kind, or rather unkind, for she had tried ever since Betsy Bobbitt first tasted candy to let her eat only those candies that were pure and wholesome. It truly was hard, because while Mother had carefully explained that penny candies were unsafe for little children to eat, on account of the cheap, impure materials used in the making, as well as the bright, dangerous colours used upon the outside to make them look attractive, still Betsy Bobbitt could not understand why other little girls and boys were allowed to eat them. Mother said she was sure the other mothers of little children did not realize how harmful they were, because if they did, they would never allow their little girls and boys to eat them. So Betsy Bobbitt tried to feel that Mother was right about it, but she couldn't quite forget those sticks of candy. One afternoon in early September, Betsy Bobbitt and several little schoolmates, on their way home from school, were very busily engaged in talking, and what do you think they were talking about? They were discussing what they wanted to do when they grew up. At first, Betsy Bobbitt was very quiet. This was most unusual, but she listened attentively to the plans of all the others. Just then they came to a candy shop, in which was displayed a most tempting array of candies. Like a flash, Betsy Bobbitt made her decision. and when she said she wanted to be a teacher of domestic science, the other little girls were so impressed that their own plans were forgotten. In fact, some of them did not even know what domestic science meant, and they were very eager to learn. So Betsy Bobbit explained as best she could what she knew about it, and how she ever came to think of such a future. She told them of her mother's friend who went to college to learn how to become a teacher of domestic science, which included knowing how to cook just everything, the best of all being the most delicious candies, and that was what she, Betsy Bobbit, wanted to study. The little girls were very much excited, and looked first at the pretty candies wistfully, and then at Betsy Bobbit with awe, as it seemed to them very wonderful for anyone to be able to make such delicious candies. Betsy Bobbit herself was so enthused that she could not wait for the others, so with another hasty glance at the candies, and a hurried goodbye to her friends, she left them and ran all the way home to tell her mother about her wonderful plan for the future. Mother knew at once that something very special must have happened, and as soon as Betsy could gain her breath, it all came out. When Betsy Bobbit finished her story, she received the happiest surprise of her short life, for Mother, seeing how earnest and eager her little girl was over her new plan, had been thinking rapidly, and so when all had been told, Betsy's mother laughed merrily at her little daughter and said, "Why wait until you are old enough to go to college? Wouldn't you like to begin to learn now?" Do you wonder Betsy Bobbit nearly fell off her chair? For when she really understood that Mother was to teach her to make candy, she bobbed about all over the room, exclaiming, "Oh, Mother, may I really and truly?" And again, "Oh, Mother, I don't think I'll even want to look at penny candy again." This pleased Mother so much that she began at once to look up all the simple ways of making candy that she herself had learned when she was a little girl like Betsy, as well as many that had been given to her or that she had cut from favourite magazines and cookbooks. When these recipes were all arranged, Betsy Bobbit began her candy making, and a happy, busy winter and spring she had indeed. Mother did not get any special outfit, but just let Betsy use the things she had in the house, and which would generally be found in any ordinary home, some of which were as follows: aluminium and agate saucepans, 1, 2, and 3 quarts, a double boiler, 2 glass and 1 tin half-pint measuring cups. These were divided into quarters, thirds, and halves. A set of measuring spoons, which measured 1 tablespoon, 1 dessert spoon, 1 teaspoon, a half teaspoon, and a fourth teaspoon. An old large steel knife that had become very flexible with constant use. Scales. A food chopper. A nut cracker. A corn popper. A long-handled wooden spoon. A small brush for buttering tins. A fine wire strainer for sifting confectioner's sugar. 1 large and 1 small egg beater. And a pair of scissors kept specially for kitchen use. Mother also wrote out the following rules for measuring and weighing, and hung them up so that Betsy could find them easily. These Betsy found very helpful. A pound of granulated sugar equals 2 cups. A pound of brown sugar equals 2 2/3 cups. A pound of confectioner's sugar equals 3 1/2 cups. A pound of powdered sugar equals 2 2/3 cups. A pound of solidly packed butter equals 2 cups. A pound of molasses equals 1 1/2 cups. A pound of corn syrup equals 1 1/4 cups. and a pound of chocolate equals 16 squares. The hints for candy making that Mother gave Betsy and which she memorized were as follows. First, to butter with a brush the inside of the saucepan from the top about 2 inches down to prevent the candy from boiling over. Second, to use fresh, cold water each time she tried the candy. Third, any candy that is to be beaten is better if allowed to cool a few minutes by standing the pan in cold water, and if when beaten it looks like smooth, thick cream, before pouring in pans. Fourth, to butter the hands well when pulling candies. Fifth, that soft ball, hard ball, thread, and brittle mean the different stages sugar reaches while cooking. When a little syrup dropped in cold water can be easily worked between the thumb and finger, it is a soft ball. When it is firm and solid, it is a hard ball. When it drops from the spoon into a fine thread, it is called thread. And when it becomes so hard it will break, it is called brittle. Sixth, never to stir hard candies unless told to do so after ingredients are well mixed and have reached the point where the syrup threads. Seventh, that uncooked foundation cream and fondant cream can be made into all sorts of candies. Eighth, that pretty, harmless colorings may be made from the following: different shades of red and pink from the juice of raspberries, strawberries, blackberries, elderberries, and cranberries, yellow from saffron, and green from spinach and beet leaves, bruised and boiled in a very little water. So Betsy followed every instruction carefully, and these are the candies Betsy Bobbitt learned to make. Betsy chose to make the hard candies first, and Mother told her she had chosen well, as the cool fall and cold winter weather were much better for these candies, as they did not become so sticky and hard to handle as in warm weather. One thing in particular Mother impressed upon Betsy's mind was this: it would be much easier to have all the materials and utensils used in making the candy ready before the cooking began. And another equally important thing was to wash all the dishes and pans and leave everything tidy and in order when finished. Butterscotch number 1. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of butter, and 2 tablespoons of cold water. When Betsy put these all in the saucepan, she remembered to dip her brush in melted butter and brush the pan about 2 inches down from the top, so that the candy would not boil over. Then she let the syrup boil, without stirring, until a little which she dropped from the spoon formed a hard ball in cold water. It was then ready to pour thinly in buttered pans and mark at once in squares. This was Betsy's favourite recipe for butterscotch, although she found the following 2 recipes very nice. Butterscotch number 2. 1 cup of granulated sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, 1 teaspoon of vinegar, and half a cup of butter. Betsy put the sugar, corn syrup, vinegar, and butter in the saucepan. Then, dipping her brush in melted butter, she brushed the top of the saucepan 2 inches down. Next, she stirred the ingredients well together before putting the saucepan on the stove, because after the syrup began to cook, it must not be stirred. When it was boiling well, Betsy tried a few drops in cold water every little while, each time remembering to use fresh water. And when it formed a hard ball, she knew it was done. The buttered pans were all ready, and into these Betsy poured the candy thinly and marked it at once into squares. Butterscotch number 3. 1 cup of molasses, 1 cup of granulated sugar, 1 tablespoon of butter, and half a teaspoon of lemon flavoring. After the molasses, sugar, and butter were put into the saucepan, and the saucepan had been well brushed 2 inches down from the top as Mother instructed, Betsy let them cook until the syrup reached the hard ball stage, when a little of it was dropped in cold water. It was then time to add the flavoring and pour at once into the buttered pans, not forgetting to mark in squares. Betsy found that butterscotch was much more tasty when thin, so that was why she buttered more than 1 pan and had it only 1/4 of an inch thick. Butter taffy. 3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of molasses, 1/4 of a cup of vinegar, 1/4 of a cup of hot water, 2 tablespoons of butter, and a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. Betsy put everything except the butter and vanilla into the saucepan and boiled these until the syrup formed a hard ball when a little was tried in cold water. Then the butter and vanilla were added, and it was cooked 3 minutes more. Betsy counted up to 180, and poured into a large buttered pan. Lemon cream candy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, 1/4 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar, a knob of butter the size of a walnut, and 2/3 of a teaspoon of lemon flavoring. Betsy dissolved the sugar in the water and let it come to the boiling point. Then she added the cream of tartar, which she first dissolved in 1 teaspoon of hot water, and when the candy was nearly done, she put in the piece of butter. When a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a hard ball, it was then time to add the flavoring and pour in a buttered pan to cool. While the candy was cooling, Betsy greased her fingertips well, and when the candy was cool enough to handle, Betsy began to pull it. At first she found it very awkward, but Mother showed her just how to do it, and before long Betsy could do it very nicely. This pulling, as Mother explained, was very quick work. Then, when the candy was white, Betsy cut it into small pieces with the scissors. Vanilla cream candy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, 1/4 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar, a knob of butter the size of a walnut, and a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. The sugar and water were put into the saucepan and let come to the boiling point. Then the cream of tartar was dissolved in 1 teaspoon of hot water, and Betsy added it to the sugar and water. She let these cook, and just before they reached the hard ball stage, added the butter. When the hard ball formed, by dropping a little of the syrup in cold water, the vanilla was added, and the candy was poured in a buttered pan to cool. In the meantime, Betsy greased her fingertips, and as soon as the candy was cool enough to handle, she began to pull it. Betsy had to work quickly, and as soon as the candy was white, she cut it into small pieces. Peppermint cream candy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, 1/4 teaspoon of cream of tartar, a knob of butter the size of a walnut, and 4 drops of oil of peppermint flavoring. After Betsy let the sugar and water come to the boiling point, she added the cream of tartar dissolved in 1 teaspoon of hot water and continued to boil until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water had nearly reached the hard ball stage. Then she added the butter. When it had quite reached the hard ball stage, Betsy took it from the fire, dropped in the 4 drops of peppermint, and poured the candy into a buttered pan to cool. Greasing her fingertips just as she did for the lemon and vanilla cream candy, Betsy proceeded to pull until white and then cut it into small pieces. Betsy's orange cream candy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, a 1/4 teaspoon of cream of tartar, a knob of butter the size of a walnut, and a teaspoon of orange flavoring. Betsy called this her own recipe because, while it was made exactly like the lemon, vanilla, and peppermint cream candies, she said to her mother one day, "Why can't I use orange flavoring and have still another change?" Mother told her there was no reason at all why she couldn't, and that she was glad to see Betsy thinking out new combinations for herself. So Betsy was delighted. And once more Mother wrote it out, for, as Betsy said, it was much easier to have it right before you under its own name than to keep turning back to the recipes that had gone before. The sugar and water were brought to the boiling point. The cream of tartar was dissolved in 1 teaspoon of hot water and added. These she let boil until a little dropped in cold water was almost hard. Then Betsy put in the butter. When it was quite hard, she took it from the fire, added the orange flavoring, and poured at once into the buttered pan to cool. Betsy found she had time to wash her saucepan, spoon, and other dishes before she needed to grease her fingers, and thus made the kitchen more tidy and attractive while she pulled the candy. Lemon Cream Taffy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1 cup of water, a 1/4 cup of vinegar, a tablespoon of butter, and half a teaspoon of lemon flavoring. After Betsy began to think for herself, she acted in such an important manner that Mother smiled to see how rapidly her little daughter was advancing. The sugar, water, and vinegar were measured carefully into the saucepan, well mixed, then placed upon the stove to boil. One thing in particular that Betsy learned from her own experience was never to let any candy she was making boil too hard. An even, steady boil made the candy much nicer, and besides, it did not then spit all over the stove and make the unpleasant odor of burned sugar in the house. Betsy tried the candy in cold water, and just before it formed a hard ball, she added the butter. When it formed a ball that was quite hard, she removed the saucepan from the fire, added the lemon flavoring, and poured it into the buttered pan. With fingers well greased, she pulled the candy, as soon as it was cool enough to handle comfortably, until it was very white, then cut it into small pieces with a pair of scissors. Orange Cream Taffy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1 cup of water, a 1/4 cup of vinegar, a tablespoon of butter, and half a teaspoon of orange flavoring. Betsy let the sugar, water, and vinegar boil until a little of the syrup, dropped in cold water, formed a hard ball. The butter was added just before it was done, and the orange flavoring as soon as it was taken from the stove. Pouring the candy into the buttered pan, Betsy let it stand until she could handle it easily. Then with well-greased fingers she pulled the candy white and cut it in pieces. Vanilla Cream Taffy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1 cup of water, 1/4 cup of vinegar, 1 tablespoon of butter, and a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. The sugar, water, and vinegar were boiled until a little of the syrup, tried by Betsy in cold water, formed a hard ball. Just before it reached this stage, Betsy slipped in the butter. As soon as it was done, Betsy took it from the fire, added the vanilla, poured it into the buttered pan, let it cool until she could handle it, then greased her fingers and pulled until it was quite white, and cut it into small pieces. Vinegar candy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, a half a cup of vinegar, and a half a cup of water. When the sugar, vinegar, and water had boiled long enough so that a little of the syrup, dropped in cold water, formed a hard ball, it was poured into a buttered pan, let cool sufficiently, and pulled. It was very simple, since Betsy did not have to stir this while cooking or add anything extra. Cream of tartar candy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1 cup of hot water, and 1 teaspoon of cream of tartar. The sugar, water, and cream of tartar were put in the saucepan and well stirred, then boiled until a little of the syrup, dropped in cold water, formed the usual hard ball. Betsy found this took about 20 minutes. Then she poured the candy into a buttered pan and let it cool so that she could handle it easily. With well-greased fingers, she pulled the candy quickly, then cut into small pieces or short sticks with the scissors. Chocolate taffy. 1 cup of granulated sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, half a cup of milk, half a cup of butter, and 2 squares of chocolate. This Betsy found to be delicious. She cooked all of the ingredients together, and when a little of the candy, dropped in cold water, was quite hard, she poured it into the buttered pan. When the candy was cool, Betsy marked it into squares. Most little girls like molasses candy, and Betsy was no exception. She thought the recipes that follow were the best of the kind she had ever tasted. Molasses candy. 1 cup of molasses, 1 cup of granulated sugar, a large knob of butter the size of an egg, 1 tablespoon of vinegar, and 1 teaspoon of baking soda. Betsy put all the above-named ingredients, except for the soda, into her saucepan to boil. When a little of the syrup, dropped in cold water, became brittle, she took the saucepan off the stove and added the soda. Then she poured the candy into the buttered pan. When it was cool enough to handle, Betsy greased her fingers and pulled the candy until it was a shiny golden brown. Then with the scissors cut it into short sticks. Peanut molasses candy, not pulled. 2 cups of molasses, 1 cup of brown sugar, 3 tablespoons of butter, a tablespoon of vinegar, and half a cup of shelled peanuts. After Betsy put the molasses, sugar, and butter together in the pan, she let them boil until they formed a hard ball when tried in cold water. Then she added the vinegar and continued cooking until it became brittle. The buttered pan was ready with the peanuts in, and the candy was poured over them. Before it became quite cool, Betsy marked it in squares. Betsy thought pulling candy the best kind of fun, and after she learned perfectly how not to get all sticky, Mother allowed her to invite a few of her little friends to have a pulling bee. This pleased Betsy and her little friends very much. One of the little girls said she knew what a husking bee was, for once when she was in the country at the time when the corn was fully grown, all the friends and neighbours round about had been invited to come and help with the husking. Betsy's mother told the little girl a pulling bee was the same idea exactly, for they were to come and help pull the candy after it was cooked. Each little girl put on one of Mother's big aprons and carefully washed her hands. Then Betsy read the names of the different recipes out loud, and Mother said they might choose 2 to make. They chose Betsy's orange cream candy and molasses candy. Mother stayed with them in case they needed her help, although Betsy took full charge. Betsy certainly managed well, for she kept each little girl busy doing her share, and when the candy was cooked and ready to pull, the real fun started. Despite Betsy's careful teaching, Mother's help was much needed in assisting some of the little girls who just could not help getting all sticky. The afternoon passed so quickly, and the candy was so good that the little crowd voted it to be the best time they had ever had. The following week, Betsy made molasses kisses. 1 cup of molasses, quarter of a cup of water, quarter of a cup of granulated sugar, quarter of a cup of honey, and 1 tablespoon of corn syrup. The molasses, water, sugar, honey, and corn syrup Betsy measured carefully into the saucepan and cooked them until, when tried in cold water, the syrup formed the usual hard ball. Pouring the candy into the buttered pan, Betsy let it cool until she could handle it easily. With well-greased fingers she pulled the candy, then cut in pieces and wrapped in wax paper. Brown sugar candy. Pulled. 1 cup of brown sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, 2 tablespoons of butter, and a tablespoon of lemon juice. Betsy put the sugar, corn syrup, and butter in the saucepan and let them boil without stirring until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water became brittle. Taking the saucepan from the fire, she added the lemon juice and poured the candy into a buttered pan, greased her fingers well, and pulled when sufficiently cool. Then with the scissors she cut in small pieces. Once, when Betsy's mother was a young girl, she visited a large farm in northern Vermont, and it was there she had her first butternuts. Betsy thought the recipes for butternut candy that follow were the best ever. Lemon butternut candy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, 1 cup of broken butternut meats, and 1 teaspoon of lemon flavoring. After Betsy boiled the sugar and water without stirring until thick enough to spin a fine thread, she added the flavoring, placed her pan in cold water, and then stirred it very quickly until it was white. She added the nuts and poured it into a buttered pan. When it was cold, she cut the candy into small squares. Orange butternut candy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, 1 cup of broken butternut meats, and a tablespoon of orange juice. Putting the sugar and water in the saucepan, Betsy let them boil without stirring until it would spin a fine thread from the tip of the spoon. The orange juice was added, and the pan placed in cold water and stirred very quickly until it was white. Now Betsy added the nuts and poured into a buttered pan, and when cold she cut the candy into small squares. Vanilla butternut candy. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, 1 cup of broken butternut meats, and a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. Like the lemon and orange butternut candy, Betsy put the sugar and water on to boil without stirring. When a fine thread spun itself from the tip of the spoon, she removed the saucepan from the fire, added the vanilla flavoring, and stood it in cold water. Stirring the candy very quickly until it was white, Betsy then added the nuts and poured it into a buttered pan. When it was cold, she cut the candy into small squares. Another candy that Betsy was very fond of was peanut brittle. and she was eager to make some of her own. Mother told her it was very easy to make if you were only careful not to let the sugar burn and worked quickly. So one day Betsy made this. Peanut brittle, 2 cups of granulated sugar, and 1 cup of shelled peanuts. For this, Betsy had to have a slow fire. Mother told her to put the sugar into the iron frying pan and explained how it would first lump, then gradually melt, and that when it was a clear pale coffee colour, it was ready to pour quickly over the nuts. Betsy had put the peanuts in a buttered pan on the back of the range so as to be ready the minute the sugar was properly melted. Here is another candy with peanuts that Betsy liked. Peanut candy, 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, 1 cup of water, 4 tablespoons of butter, and 1½ cups of shelled peanuts. The sugar, syrup, and water Betsy boiled until it was crisp or brittle when tried in cold water. Just before taking from the fire, she added the butter and nuts, then poured into buttered pans. Betsy also made plain peppermints. 2 cups of granulated sugar, ½ cup of milk, a pinch of cream of tartar, and 4 drops of oil of peppermint. After the sugar, milk, and cream of tartar were put in the saucepan, Betsy set it on the back of the range until it looked clear and watery. Then she brought it forward, and when the boiling point was reached, let it boil 1 minute, or while she counted 60. Taking it from the fire, she added the oil of peppermint drops and beat until the candy was creamy, then quickly dropped from tip of spoon on waxed paper. Sometimes this hardened before Betsy could get it all dropped, but putting the saucepan back on the stove, it would melt and she could finish the dropping. Coconut drops, 2 cups of granulated sugar, ½ cup of water, and 1 cup of prepared coconut. Betsy cooked the sugar and water until it formed a hard ball when tried in cold water, removed it from the fire, added the coconut, and beat to a cream. Like the peppermints, she dropped it quickly on waxed paper. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Roslyn Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 2. Popcorn Goodies. Betsy was glad when Mother decided on popcorn goodies, for she found it such splendid fun popping the corn. How Betsy loved to watch the kernels burst into the pretty white snowflakes. Her first attempt was just plain hot buttered popcorn. Mother was busily explaining this recipe to Betsy when Dorothy, Betsy's dearest friend, came over to spend the afternoon. Mother invited the little guest to share the fun of popping the corn, and on observing how well the little girls worked together, then and there gave Dorothy a standing invitation to join in the candy making whenever she could find the time. And you may be sure the invitation was eagerly accepted. Hot buttered corn. ½ cup of corn which has not been popped, 1/4 cup of butter, and salt. Mother saw that the fire was just right, not too hot nor too cold. She told Betsy that if it was too hot, the kernels of corn did not heat evenly, and you were apt to burn them. So Betsy followed every instruction, and as the corn popped, so also did Betsy's eyes pop with excitement to see the little kernels turn inside out. The half cup of corn she found made about 6 cups of popped corn. Betsy's mother was very particular about having her use only the corn that popped perfectly. The imperfect corn was thrown away. While Betsy was popping the corn, the butter had been standing in a large bowl in the warm kitchen, so that it was soft and creamy. Mother said it was not so nice if you let the butter melt to oil. And while the corn was still warm, Betsy added it to the creamy butter, stirring all the time. Then, with the salt shaker, she shook the fine salt through the corn. This buttered corn was so good it was quickly eaten, so Betsy often made double quantity, and many a cold winter's day she and her dearest friend popped corn. Sometimes Betsy made brown sugar popcorn candy. 2 cups of brown sugar, 6 tablespoons of water, 2 tablespoons of butter, and 1 cup of corn which has not been popped. A saucepan containing the sugar, water, and butter was placed on the back of the stove to melt the ingredients, while Betsy popped the corn, 1/2 a cup at a time. While the candy was cooking, she carefully picked over the corn, using only the kernels that were perfectly popped, and put them in a large saucepan at the back of the stove. When the candy became brittle, as soon as a little was dropped in cold water, Betsy poured it over the corn, stirred and mixed it well, removed from fire, and continued to stir until the candy cooled a little. It was then poured into a buttered pan. A heavy weight was placed on the top. Mother had to show her how. And as soon as it was cold, Betsy cut it into bars with a very sharp knife. Sometimes the knife would stick while cutting, but Mother said if she would dip the blade in water now and then, she would find it much easier. Popcorn candy. 1 cup of granulated sugar, 3 tablespoons of water, a tablespoon of butter, and a cup of corn which has not been popped. First, Betsy popped the corn, putting 1/2 a cup in the popper at a time. After picking the corn over carefully, she had about 12 cups or 3 quarts of popped corn. Then the sugar, water, and butter were put in a saucepan and cooked until it was brittle, when tried in cold water. The popped corn, which had been kept in a large saucepan at the back of the stove, was then covered with the syrup, stirred until it was well mixed, then taken from the fire, and the stirring continued till the mixture cooled a little. Now she poured it into a buttered pan, placed a weight over it, and when it was cold she cut it into bars with a sharp knife. If the knife stuck while cutting, Betsy dipped the blade in water now and then, as Mother had taught her. Popcorn balls. 1 cup of molasses, 1/2 a cup of granulated sugar, a tablespoon of butter, and a cup of corn which has not been popped. The corn Betsy popped, picked over, and put in a good-sized butter pan, then shook just a little salt over it. The butter, sugar, and molasses she boiled until it became brittle when tried in cold water. Then poured the candy slowly over the corn, stirring all the while. Betsy then buttered her hands and shaped the corn into balls as soon as it was cool enough for her to handle. Maple sugar popcorn balls. 1 cup of maple syrup, 1/2 a cup of granulated sugar, a tablespoon of butter, and a cup of corn which has not been popped. As Betsy became more and more expert in making candy, she found she could plan many ways to save time. Having everything ready to work with at the beginning made the work far easier. So while Betsy popped the corn, the maple syrup, sugar, and butter were busily boiling. Of course, Betsy had to work quickly and put her whole mind on what she was doing. By the time the corn was popped, carefully picked over and placed in a good-sized butter pan, then sprinkled with a little salt, the candy was about done. She tried a little in cold water, and when it became brittle, she poured it slowly over the corn, constantly stirring. When it was cool enough to handle, Betsy, with well-buttered fingers, shaped it into balls, which she wrapped in waxed paper. How to sugar popcorn. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, 2 tablespoons of butter, and 3/4 of a cup of corn which has not been popped. Betsy, after first popping the corn, put the sugar, water, and butter in a saucepan. When the candy was boiling, Betsy added the popcorn gradually until all had been added that the syrup would cover. Then she stirred gently from the bottom until the sugar formed grains on the corn. It was then turned out into a dish to cool. Frosted popcorn. 1 cup of molasses, half a cup of granulated sugar, a tablespoon of butter, a cup of corn which has not been popped, and powdered sugar. This was very pretty. After the popcorn was nicely popped and placed in a large buttered saucepan, Betsy cooked the molasses, sugar, and butter until it was brittle when tried in cold water, poured it over the corn slowly and mixed thoroughly. Over this she shook an abundance of powdered sugar and mixed it in until the kernels separated and rattled. Pink frosted popcorn. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, a tablespoon of butter, a cup of corn which has not been popped, powdered sugar, and strawberry juice. Betsy popped the corn, picked it over, then placed in a large buttered saucepan. The sugar, water, and butter she cooked until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water became brittle. Then she added enough strained strawberry juice, a few drops at a time, to make it just the shade of pink she liked best. This she then poured over the corn slowly, stirring all the while. Next, she shook an abundance of powdered sugar over it all and stirred it in until the kernels separated and rattled. Red frosted popcorn. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, a tablespoon of butter, a cup of corn which has not been popped, powdered sugar, and cranberry juice. The granulated sugar, water, and butter were placed in a saucepan at the back of the range to melt, while Betsy popped the corn, half a cup at a time. Picking it over carefully and throwing away all loose kernels that were not properly popped, she placed the corn in a large buttered saucepan, then cooked the syrup until a little dropped in cold water became brittle, adding the strained cranberry juice a few drops at a time until it became a brilliant red. Betsy slowly poured the candy over the corn, stirring constantly, then shaking an abundance of powdered sugar over the corn. She stirred it in until each kernel was separate. Chocolate frosted popcorn. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of water, a tablespoon of butter, 2 squares of chocolate, a cup of corn which has not been popped, and powdered sugar. This Betsy made just as she did the other frosted popcorns. She popped the corn, half a cup at a time, picked it over, and placed the perfect kernels in a large buttered saucepan, throwing away the imperfect kernels. The sugar, water, butter, and chocolate were cooked until a little of the syrup, dropped in cold water, became brittle. It was then poured slowly over the corn and stirred constantly. The powdered sugar Betsy shook over the corn in abundance and mixed until each kernel separated and rattled. At Christmas time, Betsy made a number of the different kinds of frosted popcorn. Some of them she strung for the Christmas tree, and others she used for filling little net bags. The little net bags she made of different colours, some red, some green, and others of dark blue and white net. She put a few silver stars here and there on the outside of each bag, and filled them with the frosted corn. They were most attractive, and her little friends, to each of whom she presented one, thought they were wonderful and marvelled at Betsy's original ideas. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Rosalind Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 3, Fudge, Part 1. When the Christmas holidays were over, and the excitement incident thereto had abated, Betsy was eager to continue her candy making, and when Mother suggested fudge, Betsy just bobbed and bobbed, but finally said, "Oh, I know that I will enjoy all of the different fudges, but are you sure that you have them all, Mother?" Mother smiled at her little pupil's enthusiasm and replied, "Well, Betsy, I may not have all of the fudge recipes, but I am sure I have a very large number, for fudge has always been one of my favorite candies, and I have always enjoyed making it in different ways." And as the weeks went on, Betsy made the following fudges. First, Mother explained to Betsy that to have fudge very creamy was all important, and instructed her not to beat it until it became sugary, but only until it looked like thick, heavy cream. Then it was ready to pour at once in the buttered pan and mark into squares. Coconut fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 3/4 of a cup of milk, a knob of butter the size of a walnut, and half a cup of prepared cocoa nut. All of the ingredients except the coconut Betsy let boil for 10 minutes, took them from the fire, added the coconut, beat the mixture till it thickened, and poured it into a buttered pan. Chocolate fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. The sugar, milk, and chocolate were dissolved in a saucepan at the back of the stove, then brought forward and boiled until Betsy could form a soft ball between her thumb and fingers when a little was dropped in cold water. Taking the saucepan from the stove, she placed it in a pan of cold water, added the butter and vanilla, beat it until it was like heavy cream, then poured quickly into the buttered pan and marked it into squares. When Betsy found how many different fudges could be made, she welcomed each new recipe with glee. Chocolate fudge with molasses. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1/4 of a cup of molasses, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. Putting the sugar, molasses, milk, chocolate, and butter into a saucepan, Betsy let them boil until they formed a soft ball when a little of the syrup was dropped in cold water. Then she removed the saucepan from the fire, added the vanilla, and placed the saucepan in a pan of cold water. Beating the fudge until it looked about as thick as heavy cream, Betsy poured it into a buttered pan and marked in squares. Chocolate fudge with brown sugar. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. As before, Betsy put the sugar, milk, chocolate and butter in the saucepan and on to boil. She let them cook until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball between the thumb and finger. Then, adding the vanilla, she removed the saucepan from the fire and placed it in a pan of cold water. After beating the fudge until it was as thick as heavy cream, Betsy poured it into the buttered pan and marked in squares. If Mother happened to be out of chocolate, which sometimes occurred, Betsy made a fudge with cocoa or coffee. Fudge with cocoa. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 4 tablespoons of cocoa, 1 tablespoon of butter, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. Betsy melted the butter in the saucepan first, then added the cocoa gradually, and when it was very smooth included the sugar and milk. These she let boil until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball. Then, removing the saucepan from the fire, she placed it into a pan of cold water, added the vanilla, beat the fudge until it was thick like heavy cream, and poured it in the buttered pan and marked it into squares. Fudge with coffee. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1 cup of coffee, not too strong though, and strain through cheesecloth, 2 tablespoons of butter. Let the sugar, coffee and butter cook until a little dropped in cold water forms a soft ball, Betsy explained to a friend of Mother's who happened in. Remove the saucepan from the fire and stand it in a pan of cold water. Then beat it until it looks as thick as nice heavy cream when you pour at once into a buttered pan and mark in squares. The friend liked the coffee flavour so well that she went home and made some for herself. When Betsy began to add nuts, raisins, figs, dates, marshmallows or marshmallow cream to the different kinds of fudges, Mother at first thought it unnecessary to rewrite the quantities and directions, but Betsy exclaimed, "Why, Mother, it will be so much easier if I have each recipe written out all by itself. Then I won't need to keep referring back." And Mother found Betsy was right. It saved all confusion, and of course Betsy was only a little girl. So Mother continued to make each recipe complete in itself, regardless of how little it might vary from one previously given. Chocolate walnut fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of broken up walnut meat. The sugar, milk, chocolate and butter Betsy boiled until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball. Removing the saucepan from the fire, she placed it in a pan of cold water, added the vanilla and nuts, then beat until it was thick like heavy cream. Pouring quickly into a buttered pan, she marked it into squares. Chocolate pecan fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of pecan meat. When the sugar, milk, chocolate and butter had boiled so that a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball, Betsy removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the vanilla and nuts, and beat the candy until it was as thick as heavy cream. She poured it quickly into a buttered pan and marked it into squares. Chocolate almond fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of blanched and broken almonds. Mother told Betsy to shell the almonds and measure them in the measuring cup. Then put them in a small bowl and cover with boiling water for about a minute. This she did, then drained off the water, and the little brown skins peeled off very easily. Next she cut them into small pieces, and they were ready for the fudge, which she proceeded to make in the usual manner. The sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter were boiled until they formed a soft ball, when a little of the syrup was dropped in cold water. Removing the saucepan from the fire, it was placed in a pan of cold water and the nuts and vanilla added. Then Betsy beat it well until it was thick like rich, heavy cream and poured at once into the buttered pan and marked in squares. Chocolate peanut fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of shelled peanuts. Putting the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter into a saucepan, Betsy let them boil until they reached the soft ball stage. Then, removing from the fire, she placed the saucepan in a pan of cold water, added the peanuts and vanilla, and beat until it was thick like heavy cream. Pouring it once into a buttered pan, she marked the candy in squares. Chocolate raisin fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of seeded raisins. After measuring out the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter, Betsy put them on to boil. And while these were cooking so the syrup formed a soft ball when a little of it was dropped in cold water, Betsy pecked over the raisins and cut each one in halves. Sometimes she used the seeded raisins or the small sultana raisins, or again the not-a-seed raisins. But whichever she used, she first found it necessary to put them in a bowl and cover with boiling water that she might soften and separate them easily. It only took a minute, and after draining them carefully, she turned them out onto a towel so that the extra moisture might be absorbed. Then, when the candy was done, she added the raisins and vanilla and placed the saucepan in a pan of cold water. Next, she beat the candy well, and when it was as thick as heavy cream, poured it into the buttered pan and marked in squares. Chocolate fig fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of figs, cut into small pieces. Betsy let the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter cook until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball. In the meantime, she wiped each fig carefully with a damp cloth and cut out the hard little stem. Then she cut them up into small pieces. When the candy was sufficiently cooked, she removed the saucepan from the fire and placed it in a pan of cold water, added the figs and vanilla, beat it until it was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked it into squares. Chocolate date fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of dates, which are cut into small pieces. After the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter were on the stove cooking, Betsy prepared her dates. She removed the large stone and cut each date into 4 pieces. By the time the candy had cooked so that a little of it, when dropped in cold water, formed a soft ball, Betsy removed it from the fire and placed the saucepan in a pan of cold water. Then she added the dates and vanilla, beat the candy until it was thick like heavy cream, and poured it at once into a buttered pan and marked it into squares. Chocolate marshmallow fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and 2 tablespoons of marshmallow cream. When Betsy had cooked the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter until a little of the syrup, when dropped in cold water, formed a soft ball, She removed the saucepan from the stove and stood it in a pan of cold water. The vanilla and marshmallow cream were added and the candy beaten until it was as thick as heavy cream. Then, pouring it once into the buttered pan, she marked it into squares. Sometimes Betsy added a half cup of walnuts or pecans with the marshmallow cream. This made a very rich and delicious fudge. End of Fudge, Part 1. Chapter 3 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Rosalind Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 3, Fudge, Part 2. Chocolate molasses walnut fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1/4 cup of molasses, 1/2 cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and 1/2 cup of broken walnut meats. The sugar, molasses, milk chocolate, and butter Betsy measured carefully into the saucepan, put on the stove, and let boil until a little of the syrup, dropped in cold water, formed a soft ball. Then, removing from the fire, she placed the saucepan in a pan of cold water, added the nuts and vanilla, and beat the candy until it was thick like heavy cream. Into the buttered pan she poured it quickly and marked in squares. Chocolate molasses pecan fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1/4 cup of molasses, 1/2 cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and 1/2 cup of pecan meats. The pecan nuts Mother usually bought ready shelled, so Betsy had only to measure them out with the other ingredients. Putting the sugar, molasses, milk, chocolate, and butter in the saucepan, she stirred them well together before cooking. These she boiled until a little of the syrup formed a soft ball when it was dropped in cold water. Removing the saucepan from the fire, she stood it in a pan of cold water, added the nuts and vanilla, and beat the fudge until it was thick and creamy. Pouring quickly into a buttered pan, she marked it into squares. Chocolate molasses almond fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1/4 cup of molasses, 1/2 cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and 1/2 cup of blanched almonds. Betsy blanched the almonds after she had shelled them, just as she did before, by pouring boiling water over them and letting them stand for about a minute. Then, draining off the water, she slipped off the little brown skins easily and divided the almonds in halves. The sugar, molasses, milk, chocolate, and butter she cooked to the soft ball stage, removed from fire, placed saucepan in a pan of cold water, added nuts and vanilla, then beat till it was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Chocolate molasses peanut fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1/4 cup of molasses, 1/2 cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and 1/2 cup of shelled peanuts. When Betsy had cooked the sugar, molasses, milk, chocolate, and butter so that a little of the syrup formed a soft ball when it was dropped in cold water, she removed the saucepan from the fire, placed it in a pan of cold water, added the peanuts and vanilla, beat well till it was thick and creamy, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Chocolate molasses raisin fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1/4 cup of molasses, 1/2 cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and 1/2 cup of seeded raisins. Betsy measured out a half-cup of seeded raisins, put them in a small bowl, and poured over sufficient boiling water to cover. Letting these stand a minute or two until they were easy to separate, she then drained off the water and spread the raisins on a towel, gently patting them until all the water was absorbed. Next, she cut them in halves. In the meantime, the sugar, molasses, milk, chocolate, and butter had been cooking. When a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball, Betsy removed the saucepan from the fire, placed it in a pan of cold water, added the raisins and vanilla, beat the fudge till it was thick, then poured it quickly into a buttered pan and marked it in squares. Chocolate molasses fig fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, quarter of a cup of molasses, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of figs, which have been cut into pieces. In preparing the figs, Betsy took a damp cloth and wiped each one carefully, cut out the hard little stem, then cut each fig into small pieces. The sugar, molasses, milk, chocolate, and butter were boiled until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water could be formed into a soft ball between the thumb and finger. Removing it from the fire, Betsy placed the saucepan in a pan of cold water, added the figs and vanilla, beat it till it was thick like heavy cream, then poured quickly into buttered pan and marked in squares. Chocolate molasses date fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, quarter of a cup of molasses, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of dates which have been cut into pieces. Removing the large stone from the dates, Betsy cut each one into 4 pieces. The sugar, molasses, milk, chocolate, and butter she boiled to the soft ball stage. It was then ready to remove from the fire and place the saucepan in a pan of cold water, add the dates and vanilla, beat till it was thick, and pour quickly in a buttered pan and mark in squares. Chocolate brown sugar walnut fudge. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of broken walnut meat. When Betsy had cooked the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter so that when she dropped a little of the syrup in cold water she could form a soft ball between her thumb and finger, she removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the vanilla and walnuts, beat the fudge till it was thick, and poured quickly into a buttered pan and marked in squares. Chocolate brown sugar pecan fudge. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of pecan meats. The sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter Betsy cooked to the usual softball stage, removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the vanilla and pecans, beat till it was thick, and poured quickly into a buttered pan and marked into squares. Chocolate brown sugar almond fudge. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of blanched almonds. When the almonds were shelled, Betsy liked to blanch them. After they had been covered with boiling water for about a minute, she could remove the brown skins very easily and divided them in halves. The sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter were all ready to boil. Betsy let them cook till a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball, then removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the almonds and vanilla, beat the fudge till it was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into the buttered pan, and marked in squares. Chocolate brown sugar peanut fudge. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of shelled peanuts. While the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter were cooking, Betsy shelled the peanuts. When the candy was sufficiently cooked so that a little of it, dropped in cold water, formed a soft ball between the thumb and finger, it was removed from the fire and the saucepan stood in a pan of cold water. Betsy next added the nuts and vanilla, beat the fudge till it was thick like heavy cream, poured it quickly into the buttered pan, and marked in squares. Chocolate brown sugar fig fudge. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of figs which have been cut into small pieces. The sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter were cooked until a little of the syrup, dropped in cold water, formed a soft ball. The saucepan was then removed from the fire and stood in a pan of cold water. Now Betsy added the vanilla and figs. The figs she had prepared by wiping each one with a damp cloth, removing the little hard stem, and cutting them into small pieces. She beat the fudge till it was as thick as heavy cream, poured it quickly into the buttered pan, and marked in squares. Chocolate brown sugar date fudge. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of dates which have been cut into 4 pieces. After Betsy had prepared the dates by removing the long stone and cutting each date into 4 pieces, she put the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter on to boil. As soon as the syrup formed a soft ball between the thumb and finger when a little of it was dropped in cold water, she removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the vanilla and dates, beat the fudge till it was as thick as heavy cream, then poured it quickly into a buttered pan and marked it in squares. Chocolate brown sugar raisin fudge. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of seeded raisins. While the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter were boiling, Betsy poured boiling water over the raisins, let them stand a minute or two, then drained them and spread them on a towel to absorb all of the moisture. She then cut them in halves. When a little of the candy, dropped into cold water, formed a soft ball, Betsy removed the saucepan from the stove, placed it in a pan of cold water, added the raisins and vanilla, beat the fudge until it was thick like heavy cream, then poured it quickly into a buttered pan and marked in squares. Chocolate brown sugar marshmallow fudge. 2 2/3 cups of brown sugar, half a cup of milk, 2 squares of chocolate, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and 2 tablespoons of marshmallow cream. The candies in which Betsy put marshmallow cream she considered her very choicest, as she expressed it. Cooking the sugar, milk, chocolate, and butter until a little of the syrup, when dropped in cold water, formed a soft ball, then removing from fire and standing the saucepan in a pan of cold water, she next added the vanilla and marshmallow cream, beat the fudge till it was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, then marked in squares. Cocoa walnut fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 4 tablespoons of cocoa, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of broken walnut meats. After the sugar, milk, cocoa, and butter were cooked so that a little of the syrup formed a soft ball when it was dropped in cold water, Betsy removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the nuts and flavoring, beat till it was thick like cream, then poured it quickly into a buttered pan and marked it in squares. Cocoa Pecan Fudge. 2 cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of milk, 4 tablespoons of cocoa, 1 tablespoon of butter, 1 teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and half a cup of pecan meat. Mother forgot to write out in the previous recipes that it was better to first melt your butter and add the cocoa and sugar gradually, then the milk a little at a time, so that it would be smooth. But fortunately, Betsy remembered. These she let cook until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball. Then, removing the saucepan from the fire, Betsy placed it in a pan of cold water, added the vanilla and pecan meats, beat till it was thick like heavy cream, poured it quickly into a buttered pan, and marked it in squares. End of Fudge, Part 2.
Chapter 3, Part 3 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 3, Fudge. Part 3. Cocoa Almond Fudge. Sugar granulated, 2 cups. Milk, half a cup. Cocoa, 4 tablespoons. Butter, 1 tablespoon. Flavoring, vanilla, 1 teaspoon. Almonds, blanched, half a cup. Betsy shelled the almonds, covered them with boiling water for about a minute, then removed the brown skins and divided the almonds in halves. Melting the butter in the saucepan, she added the cocoa and sugar gradually, then the milk, and let them boil until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball. Taking the saucepan from the fire, she stood it in a pan of cold water, added the vanilla and almonds, beat till it was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Cocoa Peanut Fudge. Sugar granulated, 2 cups. Milk, half a cup. Cocoa, 4 tablespoons. Butter, 1 tablespoon. Flavoring, vanilla, 1 teaspoon. Peanuts, shelled, half a cup. The butter was melted, the cocoa and sugar added gradually, the milk a little at a time, then all boiled until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball. Taking from the fire, Betsy placed the saucepan in a pan of cold water, added the vanilla and peanuts, beat until it was thick as heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Cocoa Fig Fudge. Sugar granulated, 2 cups. Milk, half a cup. Cocoa, 4 tablespoons. Butter, 1 tablespoon. Flavoring, vanilla, 1 teaspoon. Figs cut in small pieces, half a cup. When the figs were each wiped with a damp cloth, the hard little stems removed, and the figs cut into small pieces, Betsy then melted the butter, added the cocoa and sugar gradually, poured in the milk a little at a time, and boiled until a little of the syrup formed a soft ball when dropped in cold water. Removing the saucepan from the fire and standing it in a pan of cold water, she added the figs and vanilla, beat the fudge till it was as thick as heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Cocoa Date Fudge. Sugar granulated, 2 cups. Milk, half a cup. Cocoa, 4 tablespoons. Butter, 1 tablespoon. Flavoring, vanilla, 1 teaspoon. Dates, stoned, half a cup. Betsy removed the long stones from the dates, then cut each date into 4 pieces. The candy she made by first melting the butter, adding to that gradually the cocoa and sugar, then the milk a little at a time. These she let boil until a little of the syrup, when dropped in cold water, formed a soft ball. It was then ready to remove from the stove and place the saucepan in a pan of cold water. This Betsy did, then added the dates and vanilla, beating the fudge until it was as thick as heavy cream, pouring quickly into a buttered pan, and marking it in squares. Cocoa Raisin Fudge.
sugar granulated 2 cups, milk half a cup, cocoa 4 tablespoons, butter 1 tablespoon, flavoring vanilla 1 teaspoon, raisins, sultana half a cup. This time Betsy thought she would try the small sultana raisins in place of the regular seeded ones. Covering them with boiling water for a minute or two to soften, she then drained off the water and spread on a towel to dry. These did not need to be cut, but any little stems that might be on them must be picked off. After she had melted the butter, added the cocoa and sugar gradually, then the milk a little at a time, she let the mixture boil until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball. Removing from the fire, she placed the saucepan in a pan of cold water, added the raisins and vanilla, beat until the fudge was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Cocoa marshmallow fudge. Sugar granulated 2 cups. Milk half a cup. Cocoa 4 tablespoons. Butter 1 tablespoon. Flavoring vanilla 1 teaspoon. Marshmallow cream 2 tablespoons. When the butter was melted, the cocoa and sugar added gradually, the milk poured in a little at a time, then all cooked until a little of the syrup, when dropped in cold water, formed a soft ball. Betsy removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the vanilla and marshmallow cream, beat the fudge until it was thick like heavy cream, poured it quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Coffee walnut fudge. Sugar granulated 2 cups. Coffee 1 cup, not too strong and strained through cheesecloth. Butter 2 tablespoons. Walnut meats, broken, half a cup. The sugar, coffee, and butter were cooked until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball. Betsy then removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the walnut meats, beat till it was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Coffee peanut fudge. Sugar granulated 2 cups. Coffee 1 cup, not too strong and strained through cheesecloth. Butter 2 tablespoons. Pecan meats half a cup. Betsy boiled the sugar, coffee, and butter until a soft ball formed when she dropped a little of the syrup in cold water. Removing the saucepan from the fire, she placed it in a pan of cold water, added the pecan meats, then beat the fudge until it was thick like heavy cream. Pouring quickly into a buttered pan, she marked the candy into squares. Coffee almond fudge. Sugar granulated 2 cups. Coffee 1 cup, not too strong and strained through cheesecloth. Butter 2 tablespoons. Almonds blanched half a cup. While the sugar, coffee, and butter were cooking, Betsy shelled and blanched the almonds. This was done by covering the almonds with boiling water for about a minute so that the brown skins might be easily removed. The almonds were then split in halves. As soon as the candy formed a soft ball by dropping a little of the syrup in cold water, Betsy removed it from the fire, placed the saucepan in a pan of cold water, added the almonds, beat the fudge until it was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into the buttered pan, and marked in squares. Coffee peanut fudge. Sugar granulated 2 cups. Coffee 1 cup, not too strong and strained through cheesecloth. Butter 2 tablespoons. Peanuts, shelled, half a cup. Betsy shelled the peanuts while the sugar, coffee, and butter boiled until a little of the syrup dropped in cold water formed a soft ball. Then she removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the peanuts, beat the fudge until it became thick, poured it quickly into the buttered pan, and marked in squares. Coffee raisin fudge. Sugar granulated 2 cups. Coffee 1 cup, not too strong and strained through cheesecloth. Butter 2 tablespoons. Raisins, seeded, half a cup. After measuring the sugar, coffee, and butter, they were boiled until a little of the syrup, dropped in cold water, formed a soft ball. While these were cooking, Betsy poured boiling water over the raisins, let them stand for a minute or two, then drained off the water and spread on a towel to dry. When the moisture was all absorbed, Betsy cut each raisin in halves with the scissors. As soon as the candy was sufficiently cooked, Betsy removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the raisins, beat the fudge till it was thick like heavy cream, poured into the buttered pan, and marked in squares. Coffee fig fudge. Sugar granulated 2 cups. Coffee 1 cup, not too strong and strained through cheesecloth. butter 2 tablespoons, figs cut in small pieces, half a cup. The figs were wiped, stems removed, then each fig was cut in small pieces. When the sugar, coffee, and butter were cooked so that a little of the syrup tried in cold water formed a soft ball, Betsy removed the saucepan from the fire, stood it in a pan of cold water, added the figs, beat the fudge until it was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Coffee date fudge. Sugar granulated 2 cups. Coffee 1 cup, not too strong, and strained through cheesecloth. Butter 2 tablespoons. Dates, stoned, half a cup. When the long stones were removed from the dates, Betsy cut them each into 4 pieces. The sugar, coffee, and butter she cooked until a little of the syrup tried in cold water formed a soft ball. Then, removing the saucepan from the fire, she placed it in a pan of cold water, added the dates, beat the fudge till it was thick as heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. Coffee marshmallow fudge. Sugar granulated 2 cups. Coffee 1 cup, not too strong, and strained through cheesecloth. Butter 2 tablespoons. Marshmallow cream 2 tablespoons. The sugar, coffee, and butter were boiled until a little of the syrup, when tried in cold water, formed a soft ball. Then, removing the saucepan from the fire, Betsy stood it in a pan of cold water, added the marshmallow cream, beat the fudge till it was as thick as heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked in squares. End of Chapter 3, Part 3.
Chapter 3, Part 4 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 3, Fudge, Part 4. There were still other combinations in the fudges that Betsy could make, but she herself was satisfied, for the time being anyway, and as she told Mother, on extra special occasions I can add nuts to any of my recipes with marshmallow cream. Just before she started to make panache, or brown sugar nougat, as her mother's old recipe was called, Mother received a letter from a dear friend who was much interested in Betsy's candy making, in which she enclosed a new recipe. Strange to say, it was another one for fudge. It was all written out on pretty pink paper. This was it. Sour milk fudge. Sugar granulated, 2 cups. Cornstarch, 1 tablespoon. Sour milk, not too old, 1½ cups. Chocolate, 1 square. Butter, 1 tablespoon. Walnut meats, chopped, half a cup. Betsy first grated the chocolate and mixed it well with the cornstarch and sugar, then added gradually the sour milk. These she cooked until a little of the syrup tried in cold water formed a soft ball. Removing from the fire, Betsy beat the fudge until it began to sugar, then she added the butter and chopped nuts. Betsy learned that the longer you beat this fudge, the more creamy it became, and it gave a high gloss when cold. Of course, it was poured into a buttered pan and marked in squares as usual. Brown sugar nougat or panache. Sugar brown, 2 2/3 cups. Milk, 3/4 cup. Butter, size of a walnut. Flavoring, vanilla, 1 teaspoon. Walnut meats, broken, half a cup. The sugar and milk Betsy cooked until a little of the syrup tried in cold water formed a soft ball, and then standing the saucepan in cold water, she added the butter, walnut meats, and vanilla. She beat it until it was thick like heavy cream, poured quickly into a buttered pan, and marked it in squares. This was the candy that Betsy's father liked best of all, and no matter how many other delicious confections Betsy placed before him, as she did from time to time, that he might test the result of her earnest endeavors, he still persisted in preferring brown sugar nougat. He even insisted in preferring the old name, though, as Betsy told him, panache was more up to date. Betsy liked this recipe very much herself, and even more so when she added 2 tablespoons of the marshmallow cream, but as Father liked it best without the cream, she usually made it plain. Mother thought she had lost a pet recipe until one day she came upon it unexpectedly. This was it. Vassar Divinity Fudge. Sugar granulated 3 cups. Maple syrup 1 cup. Water 1 1/2 cups. Vinegar 1 tablespoon. Walnut meats 2 cups. Egg whites of 2 eggs beaten stiffly. Flavoring vanilla 1 teaspoon. For this, Betsy needed 2 saucepans. In one she put 2 cups of sugar, 1 cup of water, the maple syrup and vinegar, boiled these until they formed a soft ball in cold water, then removed from fire. In the second pan she had boiling the other cup of sugar and the 1/2 cup of water. When they had boiled so that the syrup formed a thread from the tip of the spoon, she poured it at once on the stiffly beaten whites of the eggs, beating continually, added quickly all this to the first mixture, stirred in the nuts and vanilla, beat it until it was like cream, and poured it in the buttered pan. Sometimes Betsy packed it in a deep, well-buttered loaf pan and sliced it like cake. End of Chapter 3, Fudge, Part 4.
Chapter 4 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Rosalind Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 4 Caramels. One Friday afternoon, as Mother was sitting at the window engaged in her sewing, Betsy bobbed in and exclaimed, "Mother, I want to make caramels." "Right now?" asked Mother, looking up from her sewing with a quizzical smile. "Well, no, not just now," replied Betsy, "but I really would like to make caramels." Just why Betsy wanted to make caramels puzzled Mother, until Betsy told her of the delicious caramels Dorothy's uncle sent her for a birthday remembrance, and which she had shared with her little friend. "They were wonderful," sighed Betsy. Mother looked at her daughter's wistful little face and said, "Tomorrow, dear, I will start you on caramels, and I hope they will be just as wonderful as the ones you had today, at least some of them." So here are the different caramels that Betsy made, and some of them, Betsy agreed, were quite as wonderful as Dorothy's birthday candy. Vanilla corn syrup caramels. 1 cup of granulated sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, 1/4 cup of water, 1/4 cup of vinegar, 2 tablespoons of butter, and a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. After Betsy put the sugar, corn syrup, water, and vinegar in the saucepan, she let them boil for 6 minutes before adding the butter. Then let them continue to boil until they formed a soft ball when tried in cold water. Taking the candy from the fire, she stirred in the vanilla and sometimes 1/2 cup of candied cherries cut in halves, reheated the candy, then turned it out into a buttered pan. When the candy was cool, Betsy marked it in squares but did not cut it until it was quite cold. She used a firm, sharp knife, then wrapped each caramel in waxed paper. Plain vanilla caramels. 3 cups of granulated sugar, 1 cup of condensed milk, 1 cup of water, a knob of butter the size of an egg, half a teaspoon of cream of tartar, and a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. Mother told Betsy she had heard that condensed milk was considered by some expert candy makers to give better results in caramel than cream. To the condensed milk, Betsy added the water and mixed thoroughly, then added the sugar. She let these boil, then added the butter and cream of tartar and continued the boiling until a little of the syrup, dropped in cold water, cracked between her thumb and finger. It was then ready to take from the fire. Add vanilla, pour in a buttered pan, mark in squares when cool, cut with a sharp knife when cold, and wrap in waxed paper. Rich walnut caramels. 2 cups of granulated sugar, 1 3/4 cups of corn syrup, 2 cups of cream, a cup of butter, a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and a cup of walnut meats, cut into pieces. When the sugar, syrup, 1 cup of cream and butter reached the boiling point, Betsy added the other cup of cream a little at a time so that the candy did not once stop boiling. After trying it in cold water, and when it formed a firm ball between her thumb and finger, she added the vanilla and nuts, turned it out into a buttered pan, marked into squares when it cooled, cut it with a sharp knife when cold, and wrapped it in waxed paper. Betsy found that these took a long while to make, nearly an hour. But my, weren't they worth it when she popped one into her mouth? Plain chocolate caramels. 4 squares of chocolate, a cup of brown sugar, a cup of corn syrup, a cup of milk, a heaping tablespoon of butter, and a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. Betsy let the chocolate, sugar, syrup, and milk boil until they formed a hard ball in cold water. Added the butter just before removing from the fire, then the vanilla, and poured everything into a buttered pan. Marked the caramel into squares when sufficiently cool, cut it with a sharp knife when cold, and wrapped them in waxed paper. Chocolate nut caramels. 4 squares of chocolate, 1 cup of brown sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, 1 cup of milk, a heaping tablespoon of butter, a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring, and a cup of walnut meats, cut into pieces. As soon as the chocolate, sugar, corn syrup, and milk had cooked long enough so that a little tried in cold water formed a hard ball, Betsy added the butter to the mixture before removing from the fire. When she removed the saucepan, she added the vanilla and nuts, poured into a buttered pan, marked in squares when sufficiently cool, cut with a sharp knife when cold, and wrapped in waxed paper. Betsy found that all candies worth eating took time, patience, and care to make, yet she never seemed to tire of making them. Her enthusiasm was just as fresh at each lesson, and Mother felt well repaid for her time and trouble. To be sure, Betsy had some failures, as most little girls do, but she was never discouraged and kept on practicing until she had mastered every recipe. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Roslyn Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 5, Cream Candies, Uncooked. The candies that were made without cooking were a constant source of delight, for Betsy learned so many different ways of combining them. Foundation cream. 1 egg white, the same amount of liquid, a pound of confectioner's sugar, and flavouring. Betsy put the white of the egg in the glass measuring cup, noticed carefully just how much it measured, and then added the same amount of water. Next, She flavoured it with a few drops of vanilla or almond or peppermint or strong coffee or fruit syrup of any kind, and mixed it well. The confectioner's sugar she thoroughly sifted through a hair wire strainer, then added a little of the liquid mixture at a time, until the cream was sufficiently flexible to be moulded with the fingers. This was then put in a covered bowl and set away in a cool place for 24 hours to harden. When this was ready to use, Betsy made almond creams. This needs foundation cream and blanched almonds. First, Betsy shelled the almonds, then blanched them by covering with boiling water for about a minute. This made it very easy to slip off the brown skins. Next, she split them in two. Taking some of the cream, she moulded it into balls, pressed flat, and put half of an almond on each side. Pecan creams. These need foundation cream and pecans in halves. Betsy's mother bought the pecans already shelled, as it was almost impossible to shell them without breaking them. Taking some of the cream, she moulded it into balls, pressed flat, and put half a pecan on each side. Walnut creams. This needs foundation cream and half walnuts. The cream she moulded into small balls, pressed flat, and put half a walnut on each side of the cream. Another time Betsy tried cherry creams. These need foundation cream, candied cherries, and angelica. Betsy cut the cherries lengthwise in two, shaped the cream into small balls, and pressed half a cherry on each side. The angelica she cut into strips to form stalks, then stuck a cherry on each. Sometimes she simply put the cherry inside the cream balls. The pretty combination that follows was called Neapolitan cream squares. This needs foundation cream, vanilla flavouring, and colour pastes. Betsy's mother had a large marble slab which she used for rolling out pastry, and this slab Betsy sprinkled with confectioner's sugar that had been thoroughly sifted. To the cream she added a few drops of vanilla and kneaded it in thoroughly. This she divided into 5 portions, leaving one white and colouring the others pink, green, yellow, and chocolate. Mother always bought the best flavourings, and the same concern which made these also had coloured pastes which were pure and harmless, and made according to government regulations, so Mother bought some for Betsy with directions for using. Betsy rolled out each portion alike, placed one on top of another, pressed the rolling pin lightly over them, and cut in half-inch squares with a sharp knife. Then placed the mixture on waxed paper to dry. Chocolate cream peppermints. 1 egg white, a tablespoon of water, 4 drops of oil of peppermint, confectioner's sugar, and 3 squares of chocolate. Betsy mixed the egg white, water, and oil of peppermint drops in a bowl, and added as much sifted confectioner's sugar as it would absorb. The board she sprinkled well with the sugar, then rolled out the mixture to 1/4 inch in thickness, and cut out with a small round cutter. While she was busy with this, the chocolate had melted. This she had placed in a good-sized breakfast cup, and the cup in a small shallow pan of hot water on the back of the stove. Now Betsy took 2 silver forks and dipped each round of cream in the chocolate, carefully draining each one before placing them on waxed paper. Sometimes she needed to melt a little more chocolate, as the eggs varied in size and so made more or less accordingly. One of Betsy's schoolmates gave her a recipe for lemon and orange creams that her mother often made, so Betsy tried these. Lemon creams. 1 lemon, a pinch of tartaric acid, and confectioner's sugar. First, Betty grated the rind of the lemon into a bowl, then added the lemon juice, which had been strained, the pinch of tartaric acid, and sufficient sifted confectioner's sugar to mold the mixture into small balls, which she flattened into cakes. These she covered with waxed paper and put them in a cool place, and they were ready the next day to eat. Orange creams. 1 orange, a pinch of tartaric acid, and confectioner's sugar. As for lemon creams, Betsy grated the rind of the orange into a bowl, added the strained orange juice, a pinch of tartaric acid, and sufficient sifted confectioner's sugar to mold the mixture into small balls, which she flattened into cakes. Sometimes Betsy put a half cup of walnut meats or pecan meats through the meat chopper and molded them into the cream. Then she covered it with waxed paper, put it in a cool place, and they were ready to eat the next day. She also added the nuts to the lemon creams when she wanted a change. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Dorr. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 6. Stuffed Dainties. One day, Betsy's mother bought her a pound of nice fresh marshmallows to make. Stuffed marshmallow dainties. 1 pound fresh marshmallows, or preserved ginger, or candied cherries, or candied pineapple, or pieces of figs, or pieces of raisins, or pieces of dates, or walnut meats, or pecan meats, or blanched almonds, or butternut meats, or Brazil nuts, or pieces of uncooked cooked foundation cream. Betsy found these were very easy to prepare and most delicious. All she had to do was to cut the marshmallows in two with the scissors horizontally. They look better this way when stuffed. Betsy learned in school about horizontal lines, so that she knew just what Mother meant. Then place a piece of ginger, or a candied cherry, or a piece of candied apple, or a piece of fig, or raisin, or date, or part of a walnut, pecan, almond, butternut, or Brazil nut, or small flat balls of the uncooked or cooked foundation cream on the bottom portion of the marshmallow, and then press the top piece over it. Fruit paste. 1 pound stoned dates, 1 pound seeded raisins, 1 pound figs, 1 pound candied cherries, 2 cups nut meats. All these Betsy put through the meat chopper twice. Next she put the mixture on the board and kneaded it well with sifted confectioner's sugar until she could roll it out to 1/2 inch in thickness. Then she cut in pieces and dipped them in granulated sugar. Mother also showed Betsy how to stuff raisins and dates, and Betsy found Mother's little sharp-pointed knife to be just the thing for this kind of work. Stuffed raisins with walnuts. Large fancy table raisins, walnut meats, powdered sugar. Betsy slit the raisins down one side carefully, removed the seeds, and pressed in a piece of walnut cut just the right size. Then pressed the slit together and rolled in powdered sugar. Stuffed raisins with pecans. Large fancy table raisins, pecan meats, powdered sugar. Slitting the raisins carefully on one side with a sharp-pointed knife, Betsy removed the seeds, pressed in a piece of pecan meat, squeezed the opening together, then rolled in powdered sugar. Stuffed raisins with almonds. Large fancy table raisins, blanched almonds, powdered sugar. After Betsy had prepared the raisins by slitting one side carefully and removing the seeds, she blanched the almonds she had shelled by covering with boiling water. Letting them stand about 1 minute, then draining off the water, she removed the brown skins easily. The raisins were not always large enough to hold a whole almond, so she cut the nut to fit it. then pressed the opening together and rolled in powdered sugar. Stuffed raisins with peanuts. Large fancy table raisins, shelled peanuts, powdered sugar. Betsy made a slit in each raisin carefully with a sharp knife, removed the seeds, and pressed in a peanut. After pressing the opening together, she rolled the raisin in powdered sugar. Stuffed raisins with foundation cream. Large fancy table raisins, foundation cream, powdered sugar. Betsy had the foundation cream all made. See page 92. She prepared the raisins as usual, slitting carefully on one side and removing the seeds, then made the cream into small balls and pressed into the opening, which she closed. Next, she rolled each raisin in powdered sugar. Stuffed dates with walnuts. Best fancy dates, walnut meats, powdered sugar. Betsy found that these did not take nearly as long to prepare as the raisins. With a sharp knife, she cut one side of the date, removed the long stone, filled it with a piece of walnut the right size, then pressed and rolled in powdered sugar. Stuffed dates with pecans. Best fancy dates, pecan meats, powdered sugar. Making an opening in each date with a sharp knife, Betsy removed the stone and filled with a piece of pecan meat to fit and rolled in powdered sugar. Stuffed dates with almonds. Best fancy dates, blanched almonds, powdered sugar. It was a quick job for Betsy to prepare the dates by cutting an opening and removing the long stone, but the almonds took longer. These she shelled, covered with boiling water a minute, drained them, and removed the brown skins. In each date she pressed an almond, then rolled in powdered sugar. Stuffed dates with peanuts. Best fancy dates, shelled peanuts, powdered sugar. After Betsy shelled the peanuts, she removed the long stone from each date by cutting an opening with a sharp knife. Then she filled each one with a peanut and rolled it in powdered sugar. Stuffed dates with foundation cream. Best fancy dates, foundation cream, powdered sugar. Taking the foundation cream from the refrigerator where she had kept it since making the day before, see page 92 for recipe, Betsy made it into small balls. These she pressed into the openings of the dates, which she had cut and from which the large stones had been removed. Then she rolled them in powdered sugar. Stuffed figs with walnuts. Small fancy figs, walnut meats, powdered sugar. This was the only kind of stuffed figs that Betsy and Mother liked. The figs were prepared by removing the stem and cutting carefully down the side. Then they were pulled apart and a whole walnut inserted. Next they were pressed together and lightly dusted with powdered sugar. Betsy called these her convenient sweets because, as Mother said, you could make the stuffed fruits at any time, winter, summer, spring, or fall. Betsy's grandmother was keenly interested in everything her little granddaughter undertook, and this was especially true of the candy making. Grandmother admitted that she had a sweet tooth, and Betsy often surprised her with delicious dainties. Betsy learned that Grandmother was particularly fond of stuffed fruits, and a few days before her birthday, Betsy prepared some of each kind, arranged them attractively in a large box, and on the morning of the eventful day, gave them to a delighted Grandmother. Grandmother was very much pleased with the pretty box and its sweet contents. She called Betsy's gift the sweet surprise because, as she said, I never know just what each dainty contains until I begin to eat it, and therefore I am always being surprised. End of Chapter 6. Stuffed Dainties.
Chapter 7 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Rosalind Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 7. Cream Candies Cooked. Betsy wanted to learn how to make the cooked foundation cream, or fondant as it was called, and Mother gladly taught her. Plain fondant. 3 cups of granulated sugar, 1/4 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar, 3/4 of a cup of hot water, and half a teaspoon of vanilla. The sugar, cream of tartar, and water Betsy stirred thoroughly in the saucepan and let it slowly come to the boiling point. Then she stopped stirring. After the syrup had begun boiling a few minutes, the sugar began to stick to the sides of the saucepan, but Betsy's mother took a piece of soft muslin, dipped it in cold water, and showed Betsy just how to wash it carefully off, so that not one grain even should fall into the syrup. Then, when Betsy tried the syrup by dropping a little in cold water, she was very, very careful not to stir it. When it formed a soft ball, it was ready to be taken off, and then Mother told Betsy to add the vanilla and pour the syrup slowly onto a large platter. As soon as it was cool enough to handle, Betsy began to knead it and work the cream until it was beautifully smooth. Then she wrapped it in waxed paper, put it in a covered bowl, in a cool place, for 24 hours. It was then ready to make into candies, just as she did with the uncooked foundation cream. Chocolate fondant. 3 cups of granulated sugar, 1/4 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar, 3/4 of a cup of hot water, 2 squares of chocolate, and half a teaspoon of vanilla flavoring. Putting the sugar, cream of tartar, water, and chocolate into the saucepan, Betsy stirred them well together, then let them slowly come to the boiling point. After this, she stopped stirring. When the syrup had been boiling a minute or two, and sugar began to stick to the sides of the saucepan, Betsy took a piece of soft muslin, dipped it in cold water, and very carefully wiped off every grain as Mother had taught her. Even when Betsy tried the syrup in cold water, she took particular pains not to stir it. When it reached the soft ball stage, she removed the saucepan from the fire, added the vanilla, and poured slowly onto a large platter. This she let cool sufficiently to handle, then kneaded and worked the cream until it was very smooth. Next, she wrapped it in waxed paper, put it in a covered bowl in a cool place for 24 hours, when it was ready to use for making candies. Coffee fondant. 3 cups of granulated sugar, 1/4 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar, and 3/4 of a cup of hot, strained, strong coffee. Betsy strained the coffee through a double thickness of cheesecloth, added the sugar and cream of tartar, and let them slowly come to the boiling point. When the syrup had been boiling a few minutes, the sugar began to stick to the sides of the saucepan. As this had to be removed very carefully, so that not even a grain should fall back into the syrup, Betsy took a soft piece of muslin, dipped it in cold water, and with great care removed every bit. Even when she tried the syrup to see if it had reached the softball stage, Betsy was very particular not to stir it. When the candy was cooked, Betsy poured it slowly into a large smooth platter, waited until it was cool enough to handle, then kneaded the cream until it was very smooth. Wrapping the fondant in waxed paper, Betsy put it in a covered bowl in a cool place for 24 hours. It was then ready to make into candies. Maple sugar fondant. 2 cups of broken small maple sugar, 1 cup of granulated sugar, 1/4 of a teaspoon of cream of tartar, and a cup of hot water. The maple sugar, granulated sugar, cream of tartar, and hot water were all stirred well until they began to boil. Then Betsy had to watch carefully, for sugar began to stick to the sides of the saucepan. This she had to remove, which she did by following Mother's careful instructions. She was very particular not to let one grain fall into the syrup, and when she tried the syrup to see if it would form a soft ball if a little were dropped in cold water, she took care not to stir it. Then, pouring slowly onto a large platter, Betsy let it cool until she could handle the cream, when she kneaded it till it was very smooth. The fondant was wrapped in waxed paper, put in a covered bowl, in a cool place, for 24 hours, and then made into candies. Corn syrup fondant. 1½ cups of granulated sugar, half a cup of corn syrup, quarter of a teaspoon of cream of tartar, and a third of a cup of hot water. Betsy put all the ingredients into the saucepan and let them come to the boiling point, stirring all the while. Then she stopped stirring. After the syrup had boiled a few minutes, Betsy noticed that the sugar began to stick to the sides of the saucepan. So, taking a piece of soft muslin, she dipped it in cold water and wiped all this sugar away so carefully that not a grain fell into the syrup. When Betsy tried a little of the candy in cold water, she was again careful not to stir the syrup, and as soon as it reached the softball stage, she removed the saucepan from the fire and poured the candy slowly into a large platter. Then, when it was cool enough to handle, Betsy kneaded till it was very smooth and creamy, wrapped it in waxed paper, and put it in a covered bowl in a cool place for 24 hours. Betsy found that the cooked fondant would keep a long while, and she liked to have some on hand so that she could make a dish of dainty candies at any time. The following are some of the candies made with the different flavoured fondants. Plain fondant almond creams, plain fondant pecan creams, plain fondant walnut creams, and plain fondant cherry creams. In each case, Betsy made the small balls of the plain fondant, then pressed half an almond on each side, or half a pecan, or half a walnut, or half of a candied cherry. Sometimes she put the nut or cherry inside and wrapped the fondant around it. With the chocolate fondant, she followed the same idea, making chocolate fondant almond creams, chocolate fondant pecan creams, chocolate fondant walnut creams, and chocolate fondant cherry creams. With the coffee fondant, she made coffee fondant almond creams, coffee fondant pecan creams, coffee fondant walnut creams, and coffee fondant cherry creams. With the maple sugar fondant, she made maple sugar fondant almond creams, maple sugar fondant pecan creams, maple sugar fondant walnut creams, and maple sugar fondant cherry creams. It was with the plain fondant that Betsy could make the greatest variety of candies. Every combination that she had made with the uncooked foundation cream, Betsy made with the plain fondant. When she had made Neapolitan cream squares, Betsy's mother had bought some of the colour pastes which came from an old established firm, were quite pure and harmless, and made according to government regulations. So Betsy had these to use, and again she used the pretty harmless colourings. These colour pastes last for a very long time, since very small quantities are used, just a drop or two being sufficient. Before Betsy finished her lessons in candy making, especially when she made the fondants, Mother's stock of flavourings had very much increased, for Betsy used vanilla, orange, lemon, almond, oil of peppermint, wintergreen, violet, rose, and peach. In fact, Betsy became such a little expert in her candy making that Betsy's father said it seemed a foolish waste of money for him to buy the usual box of Saturday candy, when he much preferred his own little daughter's concoctions. Mother thought this too good an opportunity to let pass, and suggested that he give the amount he usually spent each week to Betsy and leave his order with her. Father was glad to agree, and Betsy was delighted and proud to think he thought her capable enough. This enabled Betsy to form a general supply fund with which to purchase extras in the way of different kinds of nuts, candied cherries, dates, figs, raisins, etc. Cinnamon cream balls. This requires plain fondant and ground cinnamon. Betsy made the fondant into small balls, then rolled them lightly in the cinnamon. She was careful not to have very much, as it made the cinnamon taste too strong. Sometimes she would put a candied cherry inside the cream ball, or a piece of a walnut, or pecan, or almond. Cocoa cream balls. This requires plain fondant and cocoa. These Betsy made like the cinnamon cream balls by forming the fondant into small balls and rolling them in cocoa, or first putting a piece of any kind of nut or candied cherry inside the cream. Cream mints. This requires plain fondant and coloured pastes. The plain fondant she divided into as many portions as she desired colours or flavours. After colouring and flavouring to her liking, she rolled them out on Mother's marble slab until they were about 1/4 of an inch thick. Of course, she first sprinkled the slab with sifted powdered sugar. Then, with a little round cutter, Betsy would cut out the mints and place them on waxed paper to dry. Sometimes she would use the different nuts, candied cherries etic, with these, by placing a piece on top of each round. Several variations of cream mints can be made. Cream chocolate mints use the chocolate fondant. Cream coffee mints use the coffee fondant. Cream maple sugar mints use the maple sugar fondant. And cream corn syrup mints use the corn syrup fondant. Betsy made all of the different kinds of fondants into mints by simply rolling a portion of each to 1/4 inch in thickness, then cutting them out with her little round cutter. When she wanted them to be extra nice, she added the candied cherries or any kind of nut by placing a piece on top. Betsy enjoyed celebrating any and every occasion. The days devoted to St. Valentine and St. Patrick were hailed with delight. For these gala days Betsy found the cream mints to be the very best candies to make. A tiny heart-shaped cutter and another cutter in the shape of a shamrock Mother found one day while shopping, and these she brought home to Betsy. You may be sure that Betsy bobbed more than ever when Mother gave them to her. On St. Valentine's Day, Betsy remembered each member of the family, also each of her little friends, with a sweetheart for a valentine. These she made from the cream mints of different colours and cut with the heart-shaped cutter. The little cutter in the shape of the shamrock Betsy used on St. Patrick's Day to cut the cream mints, which she coloured a pretty green. Bonbons. Fondant of any kind, coloured pastes, flavourings, nuts, candied cherries, etic. Here was another way in which Betty used the fondants. One portion of plain fondant she put on one side, while the remainder was divided into as many different portions as she desired different colours or flavours. When these were shaped into balls, some plain and some with pieces of nuts or candied cherries inside, she placed them on waxed paper while she put the other portions of fondant in the small double boiler over hot water to melt. Betsy did not let the fondant get hot, but just warm. Then, taking the candies she had prepared, she dipped each one carefully into the melted fondant using 2 silver forks, and replaced them on the waxed paper to dry. In the same manner, Betsy used the chocolate fondant, the coffee fondant, the maple sugar fondant, and the corn syrup fondant. Chocolate creams. This needs fondant of any kind, coloured pastes, flavourings, nuts, candied cherries, etic, chocolate. Sometimes Betsy liked the chocolate in which she dipped her creams left unsweetened. Then again she would add a little of the plain fondant to the melted chocolate to take away the bitter taste. Betsy melted the chocolate by placing it in the double boiler over hot water. The number of squares she melted depended upon the number of creams that she intended dipping. Usually she started by melting 2 squares. The creams she prepared exactly as she did for bonbons, colouring and flavouring as her fancy dictated, shaping into balls with or without the addition of nuts and candied fruits. With 2 silver forks, Betsy found she could handle the creams nicely, drain off all the extra chocolate, and place them on wax paper to dry. Chocolate cream mints. This needs fondant of any kind, coloured pastes, flavourings, nuts, candied cherries, etc., and chocolate. These Betsy made like the plain cream mints and other cream mints. She rolled out the fondant so that it was about 1/4 of an inch in thickness, cut with the little round cutter, then dipped each round in the melted chocolate with 2 silver forks, draining off as much as possible, then placed on waxed paper to dry. One of the neighbours, hearing of Betsy's candy-making lessons, sent over a recipe for cocoa-nut cakes, and while they were not exactly candy, Betsy tried them and found them to be delicious. Cocoa-nut cakes. 1/2 pound of grated cocoa-nut, 1/2 cup of granulated sugar, 2 large or 3 small egg whites, and 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla flavouring. Betsy beat the egg whites until they were very stiff, added the sugar and vanilla, then stirred in the coconut gradually. Mother had a large tin sheet upon which Betsy placed waxed paper. Taking a teaspoon, she dropped a spoonful of the mixture at a time, shaping each cake with the spoon to a point at the top, then baked them in a moderate oven until they were a golden brown. This made about 3 dozen tiny coconut cakes. It happened to be along the latter part of March when Betsy was making the coconut cakes, and her dearest friend Dorothy was helping too. Just as Betsy was taking the large tin sheet full from the oven, the doorbell rang. Mother had a caller, and as she came in she exclaimed, "My, what is that smells so good?" Mother, with a twinkle in her eye, escorted her caller to the kitchen, where Betsy and Dorothy, all flushed and excited, were in the act of piling the cocoa-nut cakes onto a pretty dish covered with a piece of waxed paper. Mother's caller could hardly believe it was possible for little girls of such tender years to be capable of making the delicious confections. When she was told of the many kinds that they really and truly could make, she remarked, "Well, I have certainly come to just the right place." Then Mother's caller explained that she belonged to a patriotic society that was planning to have a sale in a few weeks. If Betsy and Dorothy would make her some candy, she would be very grateful. The little girls were only too delighted, and Mother promised to furnish the materials if they would do the work. To this they readily agreed, and many happy, busy spare moments they spent in preparing for, to them, the great occasion. It would take too long to tell you about the different candies they made, but every bit was sold, and when, one morning, they received a written vote of thanks from the Patriotic Society, Betsy and Dorothy felt fully repaid for all their efforts. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Roslyn Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 8 Salted Nuts. One day Betsy said, "Mother, I should like to know how to prepare salted peanuts and salted almonds." And, as usual, Mother was glad to comply with her request and teach her. Salted peanuts. 1 cup of shelled peanuts, butter or olive oil, and salt. Betsy bought the peanuts that were not cooked. These she shelled, then covered with boiling water for a minute or two. Draining off the water, she removed the little brown skins easily. Using a shallow cake tin, Betsy poured in a little olive oil. For those who do not like olive oil, a small piece of butter may be used instead. She added the peanuts, put everything into a hot oven, and cooked to a light golden brown. When done, she emptied the peanuts onto a piece of brown paper. This soaked up the extra oil or butter. Then she sprinkled lightly with salt. Salted almonds. 1 cup of shelled almonds, butter or olive oil, salt. These Betsy blanched, as she did the peanuts, by pouring boiling water over the almonds for at least a minute. Draining off the water, she was able to remove the brown skins very easily. The almonds were then placed in a shallow pan in which a little olive oil or butter had been melted, then baked in a hot oven to a light golden brown. Betsy needed to watch these constantly and shake the tin occasionally that the almonds might be evenly browned. The next step was to pour them on brown paper and sprinkle them lightly with salt. The brown paper soaked up all the extra oil or butter and made them much nicer. Next, Betsy tried glassy nuts and fruits. 1 cup of granulated sugar, 1 cup of corn syrup, 1/3 of a cup of water, walnut meats, pecan meats, butternut meats, Brazil nuts, filberts, almonds, peanuts, white grapes, raisins, pieces of orange, pieces of grapefruit, and prunes. The sugar, corn syrup, and water Betsy boiled until the syrup became brittle the minute she dropped a little in cold water. Lifting the saucepan from the fire, she placed it in a larger pan of cold water to stop the boiling immediately. Then she placed it in another pan of hot water and dipped the nuts and fruits one at a time. Betsy used a long hat pin to pick them out with, then placed them on buttered plates or waxed paper. These were always made in cold weather and eaten while crisp. If they were kept any length of time, they became sticky. This, however, never happened in Betsy's home, for they went too quickly. It took Betsy a long time, months in fact, to learn all these different ways of making candy, but she was so earnest in her work that the results were better than many grown-ups obtained. Mother felt fully repaid for the time and care it had required to teach Betsy, and Father was a much puffed-up man. He never failed to tell any guests that might be present when a dish of the homemade confections were being passed that Betsy made these. And his pride and pleasure were doubly increased when they invariably exclaimed, "Impossible! Surely a little girl so young as Betsy could never have made them." Naturally, Betsy felt glad to have these nice things said about her candies, and Mother felt still more glad that in spite of all praise, Betsy was not spoiled. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Roslyn Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. Chapter 9. Betsy's Party. When Betsy learned to make cherry creams, she said, "Mother, do you suppose I could have a Washington's birthday party? I could make such pretty things with these cherries." And Mother was so pleased with her little pupil that of course she said, "Yes." So Betsy invited 5 of her little friends, Dorothy, her very special friend, and Christina, Isabella, Amy, and Adelaide, making 6 in all, counting herself. It was to be very simple, Mother made the cake and ice cream and peanut butter sandwiches, while Betsy made the candies. For some days before, Betsy was very busy making little paper hatchets for favors. On each of these she wrote one of her little friends' names. She made a number of cherry creams like those mentioned in Chapter 5 with the Angelica, and on the day of the party she tied 3 cherries to the handle of each hatchet with narrow red, white, and blue ribbon. Mother made a delicious cake in the large angel cake tin and covered it with a thick white frosting. Before it hardened, Betsy pressed half cherries here and there all over it. Then Betsy had secured a piece of a fir tree and placed it in the center of the cake. On this she hung little bunches of cherries. It made a most attractive decoration for the center of the table. Betsy also made brown sugar nougat and pinoche with nuts, and chocolate fudge with marshmallow cream. She also had a dish of the cherry creams on the table. The 6 little girls had a very happy time, but they did wish they could learn how to make candies too. So Betsy's mother wrote this little book in order that other little girls might learn the easiest and best ways of making candies. The end. End of Chapter 9. Appendix of a Little Candy Book for a Little Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This has been read by Rosalind Carlyle. A Little Candy Book for a Little Girl by Amy L. Waterman. This is the appendix of recipes endorsed by the United States Food Administration. Chocolate dainties. Put through the meat chopper 1/2 cup each of dates, figs, and nut meats. Add 1 tablespoon of orange juice, a little grated orange peel, and 1 square of melted unsweetened chocolate. Mold into balls and roll in chopped nuts or granulated sugar. This mixture may be packed in an oiled tin, put under a weight until firm, and then cut into any shape desired. Old-fashioned molasses candy, number 1. Boil down molasses until it reaches the hard crack stage. Pour onto oiled plates and cool. Oil the hands and pull portions of the candy until it becomes light-colored. Old-fashioned molasses candy, number 2. 2 cups, which is 1 pint, of molasses, 1 tablespoon of vinegar, 2 tablespoons, which is 1 ounce, of substitute butter, half a level teaspoon of baking powder, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla or ginger extract. Put the molasses, vinegar, and butter into a saucepan. Bring to a boiling point and boil, stirring all the time until the mixture is brittle when dropped into cold water. Stir in baking powder and extract and pour into a buttered tin. When nearly cold, pull until glossy. Cut into small pieces and lay on a buttered plate or wrap in waxed paper. Sufficient for 1 pound of candy. Popcorn candy. 1 cup of syrup, 1 tablespoon of vinegar, and 2 or 3 quarts of popped corn. Boil together the syrup and vinegar until the syrup hardens when dropped in cold water. Pour this over freshly popped corn and mold into balls or fancy shapes for the Christmas tree. Little popcorn men will please the children. Mark in the features and outlines with melted chocolate. Either honey, maple syrup, molasses, white cane syrup, or corn syrup may be used. Crystallized fruits. Use your own preserves. Peach, pear, apple, quince, or watermelon rind will do. Drain from the fruit all syrup possible. Cut any size desired, sprinkle with sugar, and dry in the warmer or a very slow oven. It may be necessary to sprinkle the fruit again with sugar during the drying. When dry enough not to be at all sticky, sprinkle with sugar and pack in layers with wax papers between. This fruit may be used for dipping in bitter chocolate for bitter sweets. Fruit paste. Put through the meat chopper enough cherry, peach, or quince preserves to make a half pint with the juice. Heat fruit and add 2 tablespoons of gelatine, previously softened in a very little cold water. Stir well and continue stirring until it begins to cool and thicken. Then pour into oiled dish to make a layer 1 inch thick. Let dry slowly, sprinkle with sugar, and place in a box with wax paper between the layers. A mixture of dried apricots and dates may be used for this paste. Wash apricots and soak overnight in enough water to cover. Pour off the water, bring it to a boil, pour over apricots, and let everything stand until cool. Put apricots and dates through the meat chopper and proceed with the proportions as given. Fruit butter. Chop together equal parts of stoned raisins, dates, and figs, and add, after weighing, nuts equal in weight to the whole. The nuts may be mixed according to convenience and taste, as 1 part of black and white walnuts, pecans, almonds, peanuts, hazel, or Brazil nuts. In general, nuts grown in the locality should be used if possible. Mix thoroughly and pack in a mold for slicing. Bitter sweets. An attractive variety of candies may be made by dipping sweet fruits in bitter chocolate. Use for this purpose dates, citron, candied orange peel, or crystallized fruits. Melt unsweetened chocolate in a double boiler. Keep the chocolate just warm enough to prevent solidifying. With a silver fork, drop pieces of fruit in chocolate. See that each piece is completely covered, then remove to wax paper to harden. Maple sugar candy. 1 pound of soft maple sugar, 3/4 of a cup of top milk, 1/4 of a cup of boiling water, and 2/3 of a cup of nut meats cut into pieces. Boil together until soft ball forms in water. Remove from fire, beat until creamy, add nut meats, and pour into a greased tin. Cool slightly and mark into squares. Quick nougatines. 1 cup of marshmallows, half a cup of almond paste, 1/4 of a cup of nuts, and 1/4 of a cup of candied cherries. Put marshmallows and almond paste in a double boiler and stir until melted and well blended. Add nuts and cherries cut in small pieces and spread half an inch thick on a pan or slab sprinkled with confectioner's sugar. When firm, cut into bars 1½ inches long and half an inch wide. If desired, dip into melted chocolate. Substitutes for Christmas candies. What would Christmas be without Christmas candies? Can't you hear that wail going up from children all over the land, and from many a grown-up too? A Christmas shorn of all its sweets isn't necessary at all. But with a little forethought and some substitutes in the way of fruit and nut sweetmeats, we can do much to lessen the pull on sugar at just this time. A decrease in our annual Christmas candy consumption of, say, even 1/10, and that isn't asking very much of the home fighter. When you multiply that by 100 million of us, that will provide much energy-giving food to our army boys and our needy allies. And what more acceptable Christmas gift could we make to those over there? Remember this when you are planning for their Christmas and your own. It is splendid to make comfort kits and pack hampers of gifts for the soldier boys, but saving the sugar used to make your Christmas candies and in your own home is not only making them a Christmas gift, but is putting punch into the right arm of your country's defenders. And their right arm is of more importance just now than your sweet tooth. There are all sorts of substitutes such as stuffed dates, candied ginger, fruit pastes, and salted nuts. Not only dates, but prunes stuffed are delicious. Wash them thoroughly, take out the seed, and slip in a big fat sweet almond, and see how eagerly the children eat it. It is a food as well as a sweetmeat. Dried fruits like dates, figs, prunes, and raisins have not only sugar, but are highly nourishing. Raisins with nuts will delight any child, and if given with moderation will not prove indigestible. A combination of dates, figs, and English walnuts run through a grinder, softened with lemon juice, and cut into cakes like caramels, makes both a wholesome and a toothsome substitute for candy. Use more home salted nuts this Christmas than in previous years. Peanuts, pecans, or almonds, if prepared in olive oil, will not go begging. To candy orange or grapefruit peel means the use of some sugar, it is true, but less than for its equivalent in candy, and you're using up what would otherwise be thrown away. A wider use of maple sugar as a sweet this fall and winter will be a helpful conservation measure. Everyone with even one maple tree in his yard should tap it and boil his own syrup. Every little bit helps. Any of these substitutes, if arranged in fancy box or dainty basket, will serve the same purpose as candy for gifts. Left on table or tabouret, they will give the same festive Christmas air, and fill the munching needs of a holiday gathering. And best of all, their use will ensure more sugar and therefore more power to those fighting our war. End of appendix.